Thank you, Rama. It's a pleasure to be here. Is the mic on? I think so. So I'm going to talk about why it is still hard to be a woman in science. And we talk a lot about women in science these days. In fact, just 2 days from now, on February 28th, it's going to be National Science Day. And the theme this year that's been set by the government is Women in Science. And we're going to celebrate women in science. But as you all know, there aren't very many women in science. There haven't been very many women in science. And we celebrate the few women in science that there have been. These women have had to struggle against great odds. How was life for them? Was it difficult, specifically because they were women? Why were there so few women? And have things improved? Is it still difficult if you're a woman in science? And most importantly, can it be made easier? These are some of the things that I thought I would talk about today. One thing that I mentioned in my abstract, I left out, which is the contentious issue of whether science would change, the practice of science and the nature of science would change if there were more women doing science. I thought that I didn't have enough time to discuss that rather controversial issue, so I'm not going to discuss that. So, of course, the most famous woman scientist is Marie Curie, and we hear a lot about her struggles to discover radium, to discover polonium, how she and her husband struggled with tons of pitch blende, how they got cancer because nobody knew radioactivity was dangerous, etc. But we don't hear too much about how she struggled specifically because of being a woman, so I thought I'd highlight that a little bit. So these are two quotations from her. She says, "I've frequently been questioned, especially by women, about how I could reconcile family life with a scientific career. Well, it has not been easy." And she says, "I have a great deal of work, what with the housekeeping, the children, the teaching, and the laboratory, and I don't know how I shall manage it all." So we really don't hear that much about Madame Curie, how she's doing the housekeeping, how she's managing the cooking, and we don't think that much about those aspects of her life. And we also, I don't know how many of you know that she was honored and glorified, but she was also viciously attacked. There were a lot of racist and sexist attacks on her, especially after her husband died. So this is, for example, a newspaper that specifically published photographs of her that were meant to make her look like a criminal. She was proposed for the French Academy. There had never been a woman member. And at that time, there were these attacks in the popular press trying to say that she was not fit to be a member of the French Academy. The French Academy is somewhat special, as some of you may know, because there's only a fixed number of members for the French Academy. So you can't just elect any number of people. If someone dies, a seat becomes vacant. And then if you're competing for that seat, she was competing with men for that particular seat. And she was not elected to the French Academy. There were also rumors that she was having an affair with Langevin, who was a well-known physicist. And she was attacked very viciously for this. He was married. Her husband was dead. And the interesting thing is that he was not attacked for this. She was the one who was attacked. His career did not suffer. It was her career that suffered. And what they said was that she was bringing dishonor to the name of her dead husband. And at that time, she was also awarded the second Nobel Prize. And there were a lot of people who advised her that she should not accept this Nobel Prize because the circumstances were just too controversial. And until she could clear her name, she should not accept this Nobel Prize. I chose Emmy Noether because it's this room. She was, of course, a very well-known mathematical physicist. I mean, as a physicist, I know her mostly for Noether's theorem, but mathematicians tell me that her contributions to mathematics were much more important than her contributions even to physics. And she really transformed modern mathematics. But when she wanted to study, she was not admitted initially to the University of Erlangen because they said mixed sex classes would overthrow all academic order. Then finally, she was allowed to audit classes but not be a formal student. Finally, she was allowed to teach at the university. They were very magnanimous. They allowed her to teach but without pay. As a compliment, some people referred to her as der Noether. For those of you who know German, der is the masculine article, so the big compliment they could pay her was to say that she was like a man. When they wanted to hire her in this position, which is called Privatdozent in German, people said they couldn't hire her because she was a woman. And in a famous comment, Hilbert, who defended her, said, "I do not see that the sex of the candidate is an argument against her admission as Privatdozent. After all, we're a university, not a bathhouse." It's a position that is like a junior faculty position, kind of. And then she had to leave Germany because of the rise of Nazism, etc. And she couldn't get a position in the US either at any of the big male universities. And she finally got a position at Bryn Mawr, which is a women's college. And she wrote about Princeton that she was not welcome at Princeton, the men's university where nothing female is admitted. So what about Indian women? There are various Indian women I could talk about. I chose to mention Kampala Sohonie. I don't know how many of you know about her. She is an Indian biochemist, and she was the first Indian woman to get a PhD in any branch of science. And when she wanted to get admission to the Indian Institute of Science, her admission was violently resisted by C.V. Raman, specifically because she was a woman. And she staged a satyagraha. And finally, he admitted her, but very conditionally. He was afraid both that she wouldn't be good enough as a woman and also that her presence would distract the male students. And so he wanted to make sure that she would behave in a way that she would not distract them. She went on to do pioneering studies in nutrition. She discovered this enzyme cytochrome C. This is what she had to say about Raman. She said, "Though Raman was a great scientist, he was very narrow-minded. I can never forget the way he treated me just because I was a woman. Even then," that is after her satyagraha, "Raman didn't admit me as a regular student. This was a great insult to me. The bias against women was so bad at that time. What can one expect if even a Nobel laureate behaves in such a way?" So these are just some stories to tell you that life is not easy or was not easy for a woman in science. So, oops, I pressed the wrong thing. Why is it difficult being a woman in science? First of all, they're very few in number, and that itself poses problems when you're in a minority. Then obviously there are often pressures due to family responsibilities. There is discrimination and bias. This may be explicit, or even more insidiously, it might be implicit. There is a feeling of isolation, a lack of peer group and mentorship. You often have to face a hostile work environment. You have to deal rather often with sexual harassment and a lack of recognition, and I will discuss each of these points. So, few in number. This, I think, all of you are familiar with. By the way, for those of you who are standing at the back, there are a couple of chairs here if you want to sit. This is a very famous picture. This was at the Solvay conference in 1927. Sometimes people call this picture the picture of the brightest minds ever, etc. And this is a picture where the only woman is, of course, Madame Curie over there. And keep this picture in mind because I will refer to it again. So at that time, women were clearly in the minority. Have things changed? Let's see in a minute. So this is statistics from UNESCO. Sorry, some things got washed out. So US and Canada have disappeared and Australia has disappeared. I don't know what has happened. I can see them on the screen here. So anyway, the color of this shows the percentage of women among scientific researchers in that country, and the darker the color, the greater the percentage. And the interesting thing is that almost nowhere is it more than half. And interestingly, the country with the highest percentage is here, and that is Burma, Myanmar. I don't know why. It would be interesting to find out what is special about Burma that they have such a high percentage of women in science. These are some of the same numbers highlighted. You might be surprised by some of the numbers because I think we all have certain preconceptions and biases about where you expect the numbers to be high, and they might be wrong. So I've highlighted, for example, 39.8% in the Arab states versus 28.8% for the world. And if you compare North America and Western Europe versus sub-Saharan Africa, the numbers are almost the same. Okay, so it's pretty much the same all over the world except, and okay, look here, Central Asia, 48.1%. Okay. How does India do? I have to admit this number totally shocked me because I used to think that India was one of the better countries. I used to always tell people that, oh, you know, compared to the US, compared to Germany, which are the other countries where I'd worked, India is much better. And then I looked at the UNESCO statistics. These are just the statistics for Asian countries, and it's a percentage of scientific researchers who are women. So here is Myanmar right at the top. And India is worse than every single Asian country except Nepal. Okay? And the percentage is about 14%. And I was actually shocked by that. So all our neighbors are better than us. Pakistan is better than us. Bangladesh is better than us. Sri Lanka is better than us. And that really surprised me. So I decided to look at other statistics to see, does India do better somewhere else? So these are statistics looking at published scientific papers to see the percentage of authors of papers from different countries who are women. And I'm not sure, this might be just in biology, I think, because this paper was published in PLOS Bio. And this is lots of different countries. And the number is much higher, it's almost 30%, but still India is right at the bottom. Okay? I don't understand why. Why are we doing so badly in science? So if you look at some other statistics, for example, like you look at airline pilots, this is again a conventionally male-dominated profession. This is something BBC published last year. It looked at different airlines throughout the world and what percentage of the pilots were women. And okay, the percentage isn't that high, but if you look at the 3 airlines which have the highest percentage of women pilots. It's Indigo, SpiceJet, and Air India. And all the others, Norwegian, United, Lufthansa, British Airways, they all do worse than these 3 Indian airlines. So I don't understand why, for example, India does relatively well when it comes to airline pilots, but worse than everybody when it comes to scientists. So this is something we need to introspect about. So this is another bar chart which shows the percentage of women employed in different umbrella organizations, government organizations in India. So this is DBT, this is ICMR, DST, DAE. So DAE, you all should pay attention since you're a DAE institution. CSIR, DRDO, and ICAR. So the numbers aren't very high. For DAE, it's about 15%. What about physics? These are statistics that I assembled. I don't have your institution here. I just learned the numbers today. And incidentally, these numbers are very hard to get. Institutions don't give them to you. And the way I got them was I went to the web pages of all these institutes, and I actually counted the number of male names and female names. And in some cases, maybe I made a mistake. I don't know. But I don't think I could have made big mistakes. Sorry, I'm being very politically incorrect here. I use the blue bars for men and pink bars for women. But you see here, TIFR, worst by far. Okay? And no, it's the actual numbers. They're the numbers. Okay? So, but clearly, I mean, these are really awful numbers. Okay? I told one professor in TIFR, do you know that your institute has the worst, has the lowest ratio of women faculty of any institute in India? And he said, oh, that's because we're the best. So, okay, so now pressures due to family responsibilities. These are some quotations that I took from Leelavati's Daughters. Many of you must have seen this book, Leelavati's Daughters. They're short autobiographies by women scientists from India. So I'll read them out. The principal addressed our class and urged the girls who had opted for science to give up their seats in favor of boys with lower marks. My husband did not want me to go away for a long time, but somehow I could convince him. I fought a lot to convince my parents about the importance of going abroad for postdoctoral studies. It was not common for a girl to stay on her own in distant places. I got married. Though I was not keen to get married, I had to fulfill my parents' wishes. Upon the arrival of my son, I found it very hard to devote myself full-time to research. My husband, a well-known astrophysicist, respected my wish to study mathematics, though he too did not wish me to prioritize career over family. And I should emphasize that these are all quotations by women who went on to stay in science and overcome these difficulties and persisted in their careers. So you have to think about all those women who faced these objections and dropped out. So what about dropping out? So if you look in the US at the percentage of women in academic fields, then they have what they call the leaky pipeline. So at every stage, there's a drop in the percentage of women. So you go from university graduates to PhD students, postdocs, assistant professors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a drop at every stage. In India, we seem to have a rather different pattern, which I call the waterfall. So if you look at the percentage of science PhDs, it's rather high. It's about 44%. And if you look at the science workforce, it's 14.9%. Now, you may think, oh, that's just a function of time. It's because things are changing. Maybe if I look at it 20 or 30 years from now, in the science workforce, there will be 14%. But sadly, that does not seem to be the case. If you trace back, we have had a rather large percentage of science PhDs going to women for quite a long time. And we seem to be losing women after the PhD. So women are going on to do a PhD in science in rather large percentages, and then we are losing them. And this is really unfortunate. So if you look at the women who are doing science now, and you see if they've had a break in their education and career, then you find that about 25% of them have had a break in their career. Okay, so this does not include those who just dropped out and stayed dropped out. And if you ask them why they had this break in their career, then the main reason is family care. Then the next is location shift. And location shift, let's face it, most of the time it happens because somebody gets married and has to move to another city. Then there's other reasons. I have no idea what that means. And then in small numbers, it's family objection to working. And incidentally, I haven't put that chart here, but if you ask women why did they then choose to come back to work, the most common reason for that they give for coming back to work is love for science. So that is, I think, it's heartwarming, but in some ways, it also breaks my heart. What about becoming a parent? So this is self-reporting, but here this is a huge survey that was done. The results were just released last year. So the survey is called the Gender Gap in Science, and it surveyed more than 30,000 scientists from 159 countries. And it asked them, did becoming a parent affect your career progression? And the green bars are women, and the red bars are men. And this is by subject, so astronomy, biology, chemistry. Here is physics, for example. And you can see that it clearly affects women's careers more than it affects men's careers, though to some extent it does affect men's careers as well. Why does it affect women's careers? Part of it is household responsibilities and childcare. So this is a survey of 15,000 physicists worldwide, and they were asked, who does the majority of the housework in your family? And in less developed countries, 40% of women said myself, and 8% of men said myself. And in highly developed countries, 33% of women said myself, and 8% of men said myself. So it really doesn't matter much whether you're in a highly developed country or a less developed country. The burden of housework seems to fall disproportionately on women. There is also the two-body problem. So increasingly, you find couples in science. So because there's so few women in science, it's very common for a woman scientist to be married to a male scientist, but it's less common for a male scientist to be married to a female scientist, just because there aren't enough women to go around. Okay? And many institutes, especially in India, have a policy that they will not hire couples. In some cases, it's a written policy, but very often it's an unwritten policy. There are also all kinds of biases. For example, if the couple are in the same field and they work together, I have often heard people assume that the work has been done primarily by the man. Okay? I mean, I've heard it been said very often, oh, she publishes all her papers with her husband. How do we know how much she contributed to it? I very rarely hear someone say, oh, he publishes all his papers with his wife. How do we know how much he contributed to it? Okay, and so this is a survey that was done by Nature, where they asked people, how severe has the two-body problem been for you? This is finding two jobs in the same city. Now, if you're in a city like Bangalore, at least you might hope to be able to find jobs in two different institutions. But if you're in a smaller city in India, then it's very unlikely that there are two good institutions where you can both find jobs. So unless an institution is willing to hire you both, it's going to be very, very difficult. So here is how severe men find it in the green bars and women in the blue bars. This first one is for India. And you can see, again, that in every single case, this is much more of a problem for women than for men. Age limits for jobs. There's an unwritten rule that one has to be under 35 to get a faculty position. The UGC has said that there's no official policy on this. There is no age limit. But a lot of people operate by this rule. And this affects women disproportionately because women are more likely to have had a break in their career if they've had children, especially. And also, it's not always unwritten. For example, I found this postdoc advertisement for an institute in India. And it says here, must not be over 35 years. Okay? And also for PhD positions, sometimes, I mean, there's no age limit specified, but I have seen committees where they say, oh, this person's too old, we shouldn't take him or her. And again, it's more often her than him. So discrimination and bias. Okay, I don't know how they quantified it, so that's why I just put this statement up there. In this same gender gap in science survey, they said men are 4.8 times as likely to say they have never experienced discrimination as women. Why is there discrimination? Is there a productivity gap? Now, research does seem to show that women are less productive than men in the sense that they publish fewer papers. Okay? Across fields, this seems to be true. For example, this is in maths. This is the ratio of papers published by women relative to men in maths in the years after their career started. Okay, this is depending on when their career started. But there's also been studies that suggest that women publish fewer papers, but they tend to publish longer papers. And if you are in some committee where they're just counting papers, then women are going to suffer from this policy. And supposing you account for the fact that women are publishing less, supposing you compare how you evaluate a woman with a man compared to a man who's published exactly the same number of papers, then what happens? So there have been studies of this. So for example, this was published in Nature in '97. So they studied grants for the Medical Research Council in Sweden. So these were grants where they really give a score to every application based on different parameters. And they also compared it to their performance based on how many publications they had and the impact factor of the journal, etc. So on this axis is the impact that they quantified based on the number of publications they had and the journal they published in. And this is the score given by the referees. And this is the score given to men, and this is the score given to women. And you can see that for the same impact, men were ranked much higher than women. And in fact, they concluded from this that a woman had to perform 2.5 times as well to get the same ranking as a man. Okay, so that's a huge hill to climb if you have to do 2.5 times as much work. And they also said that basically to get the same ranking as a man, you have to have 3 extra papers in science or nature. Okay. There's another similar study where they gave the same CVs to faculty, asked them to evaluate them, and they randomly changed the name. This was in the US. I think the names they gave were Jennifer and James. And they looked at how they ranked them. And of course, they ranked them higher when it had a male name. And the interesting thing is that both men and women ranked them higher when it had the male name. Okay. So here is this riddle. I'm not going to ask you the riddle because I think you may get it just because of the context. So there's this riddle. A man and his son were at a level crossing in their car. A train came and hit the car. The man was killed instantly. His son was severely wounded. The son was taken to the hospital and ambulance and wheeled to the operation theater for immediate surgery. The surgeon came in masked and gowned, but looked at the patient and said, "I can't operate on this boy. He is my son. How is this possible?" And of course, it's possible because the surgeon is the mother. But when people hear surgeon, they immediately see a man. And I have asked this riddle to people, not when we're talking about women and science, and they have said, it's the stepfather, it's the godfather, it's the grandfather, and they never think of mother. And these are people who are liberal, who would even say they're feminist. Okay, so why do we have these inbuilt visions? It's, okay, so here now I have to make a very shameful confession. Okay, so long ago, many, many years ago, the very first time I went on a plane which was flown by a woman, the pilot's voice came on, and she said, you know, "Good morning, this is your pilot speaking." And for a fraction of a second, I thought, oh my God, the pilot is a woman. I hope she knows how to fly the plane. And then I was just appalled at myself. I thought, how can I think this? This is so against everything I believe in. So these biases are really, really deep-rooted in us. And if I can have that kind of idea, it's not surprising that, you know, some general chauvinist guy has biases. Okay, so there's this test which I recommend that you all take. It's called Implicit Bias. Just Google Harvard Implicit Attitude Test. Okay, and there are lots of, it looks at your implicit bias for many, many things. For example, if you're from India, it might look at how your implicit bias is about race, or about India versus Pakistan, or about gender and science. The first time I took this gender and science test, which was 20 years ago, it told me I had a very strong bias that men should do science and art should do humanities. And again, I was appalled. I took the test again yesterday, and it said your data suggests a slight association of female with science and male with humanities. Okay, so I was very pleased, but also in the meantime, I know how the test works, so maybe I cheated a bit, I don't know. Okay, so why do we have this gender stereotyping? It's because of textbooks, you know, like this textbooks I looked, and it shows various professions, and the only profession which is shown with a woman is school teacher. All the other professions are men. Of course, I'm assuming that if you show someone with short hair and it's a man, so maybe I'm making some stereotyping also, I don't know. So lack of recognition. So this is a picture that our DST secretary tweeted recently. It shows the President of India, the Minister of Science and Technology, DST Secretary, Directors of IITs, Directors of ISERs, etc. Do you see any women in the picture? No, there's not a single woman in the picture. Okay, so these are the top leaders of science in our country, and no women. Women in science academies, that's another recognition. Percentage of women, it only goes up to 30%. And okay, South Africa and Mexico have 30%. And nowhere does it go higher than that. And in India, it is much, much lower. Nobel Prizes to women. Physics, 3 out of 213. Chemistry, 5 out of 184. Medicine, 12 out of 219. Add them all up, it's 3.24%. And how did Madame Curie get 2 Nobel Prizes? So the story of her first Nobel Prize is the Nobel Committee didn't want to give it to her. They were going to give it to Becquerel and Pierre Curie. And Pierre Curie found out, and he wrote to the Nobel Committee pleading with them to give it to her as well, and they relented and gave it to her. Okay? Bhatnagar Prizes in India. Okay? So physics, 1 out of 100. Chemistry, 3 out of 96, etc. See the whole number. Total 18 out of 542, again 3%, just like the Nobel Prizes. So at least we're not doing any worse than the Nobel Prizes, but I mean 3%, that's just awful. Okay. There's some very famous cases where women were not given the Nobel Prize. For example, this is Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, who discovered pulsars. Her PhD advisor did not believe her. I'm sure many of you know this story. And she had to work hard to convince him that she discovered something. And then when the Nobel Prize was given, of course, he was given it and not she. But it's even worse than that, because she has told us that she couldn't even get a postdoc position after that, because he told everybody that she was not a very good student. And I was there when Sir Martin Rees, who was the Astronomer Royal and the president of the Royal Society, was asked, didn't he think it was bad that she was not given the Nobel Prize? And his reply was, I don't see why she should have been given the Nobel Prize. After all, she wasn't really serious about physics. She was just following her husband around. And this was in 2014. So, I mean, at least he should have been aware of political correctness at the very least by then. Okay? But at least in 2018, she was awarded the Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics. So she did get some belated recognition. Isolation, lack of peer group and mentorship. So this is a picture of me at a physics conference. Can you find me? Can you find any women? So I'm there, okay? And there's one other woman somewhere at the back, I think. Somewhere. I remember there was one other woman. So it's not very different from Madame Curie at the Solvay conference, okay? Lack of informal networks, okay? So it still happens that the men go out drinking after work and the women are not invited along very often. And why does, either they're not invited along because it's not acceptable to go along, or they're too busy because they have family commitments, etc. And why should you want to go along? Maybe just to socialize, but also because in these meetings, collaborations are established, you get advice on how to reply to your referee report, how to write your grant proposal, etc. So these are important meetings. And I'll tell you, I mean, once some of the guys at work were going out drinking, and of course they never asked me along, but once I asked, can I come too? And they looked at me and then they said, no. And I was really shocked, and I said, what do you mean no? How can you say no to me? And then one of them looked and said, a decent woman wouldn't come along where we are going. And I really don't know where they were going that he could say that, you know. So, a hostile work environment. I mean, I have lots and lots of little stories about just little things that remind you that you're a woman and you're different. Like my first day in college, geology class, the teacher teaches you about cleavage of minerals, and the guy sitting next to me, who's now one of India's most famous writers, turns and says, cleavage, geology class is getting really interesting, you know. And then when I left college, many guys came and told me, you know, you're the only girl I've ever met who's smarter than me. And I was not very flattered because these were mostly the dumbest guys in the class. So I didn't know how to react. And I mean, lots and lots of stories. Like when I was in IIT, there was a debate about what should be the symbol, the mascot for IIT. And one guy spoke on how it should be sunglasses to symbolize the blind eye they have to turn to the ugly IIT females. And nobody found this objectionable. And then inversion therapies, when I was at Harvard, my office mate was this big, tall French guy. And those days I weighed about half of what I weigh now. And when he was bored, he would just pick me up and turn me upside down and hold me upside down, you know, and he would say that's inversion therapy. And of course, often I've been asked whether I was the secretary of the group. So these are all just small, small things that remind you that you are not one of the guys. And I've had much worse experiences, which I don't want to talk about here. Huh? Oh, I had things painted about me in the road in IIT. So these are again quotations from Leelavati's daughters, not having a loud voice or aggressive personalities, confused with not having confidence in one's work. I think I'll skip these. I'll talk about Rosalind Franklin as an example of misogyny. These are quotations from James Watson's The Double Helix. It says, you know, he says about Rosalind Franklin, I guess most of you know that the role she played in the discovery of DNA, that her X-ray pictures what gave them the clue. But Watson talks awfully about her. He says, by choice, she did not emphasize her feminine qualities. Though her features were strong, she was not unattractive and might have been quite stunning had she taken even a mild interest in clothes. This she did not. There was never lipstick. Her dresses showed all the imagination of English blue-stocking adolescents. It was quite easy to imagine her the product of an unsatisfied mother who unduly stressed the desirability of professional careers that could save bright girls from marriages to dull men. And then, you know, this, he says she had to be put in her place. He's talking about Maurice Wilkins. He says it would be very difficult for Maurice to maintain a dominant position that would allow him to think unhindered about DNA. Unfortunately, Maurice couldn't see any decent way to give Rosie the boot. To start with, she had been given to think that she had the position for several years. Also, he's kind enough to say there's no denying that she had a good brain. If only she could keep her emotions under control, there would be a good chance she could really help him as opposed to do work on her own. Okay, and why? I mean, Aaron Klug says to defend her, he says she was a pretty tough person, single-minded, spoke what she believed, and could in fact be quite fierce. And if she had been a man, it would have gone totally unremarked. So this is the problem that women have. Okay, if you are tough, then people say you are, okay, I won't say the word, but it starts with a B, okay? And if you are soft and gentle, they just ride roughshod all over you. So you really can't win if you're a woman. And this is what, I mean, there are different words for it. This is Kanye West and Taylor Swift. He grabbed the mic away from her and spoke. And this is something women encounter all the time. Okay, you're talking at a meeting and people don't let you say what you want to say. They just break into what you are saying. Or you have an idea and somebody else takes away your idea. or you say, someone repeats the same thing, and they say, oh, he had a very good idea. And you want to say, but I just said that, you know. And most women have this experience. Now, I started out being very shy and introverted, and I used to ask questions saying, maybe I didn't understand you correctly, and maybe I am wrong, but. And then I found people didn't pay any attention to me, so I learned to I trained myself to ask questions confidently and say, excuse me, I don't think I agree with you. I think it is this way. And then people started telling me I'm really aggressive and really assertive and really rude. And I think if I'd been a man, they wouldn't have reacted that way. So sexual harassment, I don't want to say too much about it except to show you these statistics. This is again from the Gender Gap in Science. It shows the percentage of men and women indicating that they have personally encountered sexual harassment. You see it varies between 30 and 40%, 20 and 40% amongst women in all fields. And also there is some amongst men who have encountered it, 3 to 5%. So it's really widespread. We should not ignore that it's a problem. So I think I'm almost out of time, so I don't want to say much about proactive measures and success stories. I will just jump to this, because I just want to tell you that we are doing these career development workshops for women in physics. So this is these workshops that we do because we think that men have these networks where they can pick up these skills unofficially to succeed in their careers, and women, because they're so isolated in physics, often miss out. So these workshops have several purposes. They give women a space in which to share their stories. They also teach women these skills like how to write a better paper, how to reply to a referee report, how to write a grant proposal, how to make your slides look better, how to give a better talk, those kinds of skills. And they also help them meet women who have succeeded in their careers, from whom they can maybe pick up some tips. And also these women form a network who can then support each other in the future. So we've done several of these workshops at ICTP in Trieste, and we also did one at the new ICTP in Rwanda, and we'll be doing one here in May 5th to 8th here at ICTS. So, and I do want to just say that you shouldn't think everything is negative. I do get along with my male colleagues. This is at my birthday last year. Just to say that it's not like, you know, I'm at war with my male colleagues or anything like that. And the message I have for women is stay strong and don't give up. Thank you. Okay. So, well, I wanted to say that, okay, this is something that's got a lot of press, obviously, that the Chandrayaan-2 mission had the project director and mission director as women. It was unfortunate that it was not a successful mission. Otherwise, it would have been even more in the news, I think. I do think that, unfortunately, I mean, they made this movie, Mission Mangal, which was meant to promote women in science, but the way they did it, I have some problems with. Like, you know, she gets her ideas through while making puris and stuff like that. I wanted to say that the DST has these women scientist schemes to help women come back after a break in career. DST and DBT have these schemes, and I think a lot of women have benefited from these schemes. Uh, so Smriti Irani did one thing which I think we have to give her credit for, which is the MHRD has the ability to nominate two people to each board of governors of an NIT or a central university or an IIT, etc. And what she did was all her nominees were women. So this was, I think, a very interesting thing she did. So this is the letter, for example, for the NITs. You see that every single nominee is a woman. So you will recognize many of the names. This was something, many conferences don't have women speakers. So how do you work on it? This is a series of conferences I've been involved with, which of course had mostly male speakers and very few women speakers. And this conference, it rotates. It always has 3 organizers. And one year, all 3 of the organizers were women. I was one of them. And we made a special effort to get women speakers. And how we did it is how the speakers are selected here is there's a committee that votes on the speakers. But we made sure that a lot of the nominees were women. And then the committee voted. And then we got a lot of women, relatively. And so it's just that people never bother to suggest the names of women speakers. So it's not like we had less good speakers or anything. In fact, people told us it was one of the best ever. But people just ignore the women, and then people said things like, oh, she'll never come. And we said, let's nominate her anyway, and then she came. So if you make a deliberate effort, you do get women speakers. I also know some women who say they will boycott conferences unless there's a certain percentage of women speakers, etc. And I think we have to be more proactive about things like that. I wanted to say that for me, having a network of mentors and friends, both men and women, has helped a lot, which is what initially gave me the idea of having these workshops, saying, okay, I have this network, how can I provide a network for other women? And that's all. You had a question.
Yeah, so in the initial slides that you showed, so it's going to be something like statistics, but you showed like the Indian women were like on the lower end of the bar chart stuff. So, but we have a dramatically large population. So, was this because of that, or is it like they actually normalized it to some?
No, it's percentage of researchers in the country who are women. So of the total number of researchers in the country, we have the lowest fraction who are women.
But if we have like something like...
So if you look at absolute numbers, okay, we have a lot of women. If you look at absolute numbers, because we have a large, okay, we don't have such a large scientific community, but we have a relatively large scientific community if you compare to, say, Bangladesh. So we will have more women scientists than Bangladesh has, but as a percentage, we have less. Yeah. I'm very disappointed that there are no more questions. Yeah, Raj.
So what are the concrete things that institutions can do? I mean, must have thought about that.
Yeah, so I think I did have a slide about that, but let me see if I have. Okay, so these are some of the things that I think are obvious things. Many of them are institutional, like you can have outreach programs for schoolgirls, mentorship programs for girls and young women. You can introduce flexi time, daycare centers at workplaces. Do you all have a daycare center here? You do, that's very good. Relaxation of age limits, more childcare leave for both parents. Gender audits and ratings is something the government is planning to introduce. So in the UK, they have something called the Athena Swan program, which gives ratings for institutions depending on how gender-friendly they are, women-friendly they are. And they're planning to introduce something like that here. I think there's some little things that institutions can do. For example, when you have a job advertisement, you just add that sentence saying women and minorities are especially encouraged to apply. And that already sends a positive signal. You might get more applications, I think. And I think that's a very small thing that you can do. So even little things like that. And then I think you should have policies. I mean, I know you're an enlightened institute, so I'm sure it doesn't happen. But you should sensitize people that certain questions should not be asked at interviews. You should have people watching that, women are not interrupted when they're speaking. Uh, Someone should be saying, no, let her finish her sentence, things like this. I think these are very small measures that, however, change the climate for women. Yeah.
So you talked a lot about science, but is the problem broader in academia? Are the non-science subjects?
Well, I think the problem is certainly there in our society as a whole, but certainly in the humanities, the percentages are not as low as they are in science.
Some of the systemic issues probably.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do not understand completely why science is so bad. Yeah.
Can the statistics for the physics fraction of and the fraction of women in biology, something like that. So there is just some difference in the statistics. How do you infer that statistics in India basically?
So, I mean, certainly the percentage of women in biology is higher. I do not completely understand why.
Yeah.
And that is true throughout the world. Not throughout the world, there are exceptions. For example, I learned recently that in Palestine, for example, physics is considered a women's subject, and there are more women than men doing physics. And when a friend of mine went to Palestine to work with women about women in physics programs, he said, "What are you talking about? Physics is a woman's subject." So, yeah, Abhishek. Yeah, there has been discussion, but in general, most people react very negatively to it. Men and women react negatively to it because they immediately say quota, reservation, and people start reacting negatively to it. So I found that in general, people don't like the idea of having affirmative action. Yeah. You mean have more women on committees? So that does seem to be happening right now. Uh, Sometimes I regret it because then I feel I'm on every damn committee. So, but no, I think it's a good thing, of course. It is good that they have women on committees. What I don't understand is why they put the same few women on every committee, because there are there are enough of us to go around. Um, it is good, but even on committees, sometimes women's voices aren't heard enough. Yeah.
Was my personal stereotype of the Middle Eastern and Arab the personal stereotype, and I think many of us have it. But statistically, they have a larger fraction of.
Yeah, that's why I showed that number.
Why, like what's the reason specifically? Is there a reason they have more than India has? Because India, you're saying it's also surprising for you because India is like India is lacking in terms of the fraction of women society. Why is that?
I don't know enough about it. Some people have suggested to me that countries where science is valued have less women. So I do not know if this is true. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out. This is what has been suggested to me as a possibility. I really do not know. And also they say that countries where science as a profession is paid less have less women because women traditionally do less well-paid jobs. So I do not know if this is true. I don't know. Yeah, it would be interesting to look at that. I really don't know. Yeah. Yeah. I don't understand your question. I'm going to sit because my knee is hurting, so I'm going to sit on the chair. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so certainly, I mean, the US has been working a lot to improve the percentage of women in sciences, and it does seem to have improved significantly. Um, I mean, when I was doing my PhD, we were 2 women in a class of 30. So that was shockingly low. I mean, in India, it was much higher. Now they have rates that are comparable to us. So they have increased the rates there. And they certainly do a lot of aggressive affirmative action to hire women faculty, etc. So we can learn from some of those policies, but I think we should be careful because as some of the charts I showed you displayed, the problems are different from country to country after the PhD because they get married and have children. That may not be the main problem in the US. So we shouldn't, I mean, there have been a lot of meetings that the government has organized with women's groups from the US, from the UK, from Germany, from France, etc., saying we should learn from them. But sometimes the nature of the problem is different, and sometimes we can also teach them things, I think. In fact, I was quite irritated once. There was a meeting with the UK, and the woman there said, we have no problem in the UK. We have no problems regarding women in science. We have solved all our problems, but we can advise you. And I said, well, I visited the University of Cambridge, and there were no women faculty in the department I was in. And she said, well, in some subjects, there may be problems. And I said, yes, like physics and chemistry and maths and engineering, and she got very angry. So
So you mentioned at some point that the distinction between explicit and implicit bias, and bias in many ways is more insidious than. So do you have any suggestions for ways in which you can sensitize people to bias? Because it's something that even people who think they're liberal, they're thinking, as you mentioned.
well, the first thing I would suggest is that everybody go and take this Harvard test on implicit bias and check whether you have it. Because I thought I didn't have it first, and then I was shocked to find I have it. So first check whether you have it. And yeah, do some introspection and realize that you have it. And then
Yes, that sort of individual. I mean, I happen to have visited First Implicit before and taken many of the tests, but as you said, I also know how it works.
did you find that you had it, or
I took many of the other tests before about race and other things. And by the time I got around to
you
it,
knew how it worked? Yeah.
it's not clear for me.
Yeah.
But also as a mandatory program, I think it's worthwhile having it at institutions to have some kind of a sensitization.
Yeah, I think one can have workshops where you train people about this. Definitely, yes. I think it's worth doing because for the most part, the people I've had to deal with who've been discriminatory have not been outright sexist. For example, I was on a selection panel for a faculty position where finally it came down to two candidates, a man and a woman. And the man had fewer publications than the woman by a factor of 10. So you would think there should be no question there. But ultimately, the man was rated higher. And it was all subjective assessments. They said the man is very creative, he has potential, he has drive. And for the woman, it was said that she's unimaginative. We think her ideas are not her own. She does not seem like she has great upward trajectory, things like this. Now, these are things which it's very hard to dispute because they're so subjective. And I don't think anybody on the committee was explicitly sexist. And I don't think anybody thought, oh, she's a woman and he's a man. But this was some implicit bias going on. And right then and there, even I didn't think about gender. I went back and thought about it and thought, wait a minute, what happened here? Why did they make these comments about him and these comments about her? And I thought gender played a big component. But then when I went back and talked to the people on the committee, they were really angry with me because they felt I was accusing them of being sexist and they reacted very negatively. And I think if they had been more sensitized to issues regarding implicit bias, it might have been better. So something like that, I think it would be better.
Comment on this because we are talking about sensitization. I think it begins at home. It begins at a very early age as a child because we are grown up in a way. I'm a woman, and we all are men. We all are grown up in a way that we assume certain things, even if we are educated or we think we are liberal. So I think that sensitization should begin at home. We all should think of it. If we are growing up, we will have children, and we can start at home. We can have workshops because we are grown up now.
Yeah, that's what I said. I mean, it all starts with school textbooks, what parents say, saying, behave like a boy, don't cry, all these little things.
And also I have noticed school children, once the girl, supposing the girl and the boy goes back home, the girl has to go and cook. The boy can sit with the homework or play, but the girl has to go and cook and then do her homework a little bit. And this cooking thing, I think girls should not enter the kitchen. That's my
I have a couple of questions. One is when you show the percentages, are they percentages of educated women, or like are they also reflective of percentage of men who are educated and percentage of women?
Which percentages?
Like earlier there were a lot of facts, no? Like about when you said about 14% of the 40% make it to.
No, so that was saying that of all PhDs in science, 40% go to women. And of all researchers in science, 14% are women.
Okay, and is it also reflective of like of all men? X percentage is educated of all women in India. In India's case.
No. It is saying.
No. I'm just asking, are they correlated or not? The reason why I asked is because there was a recent study in Kerala where women were not finding grooms because men were not educated. At least not as educated as women.
No, but
so that was my
No, my statistic is saying that if you look at PhDs, those who get science PhDs, say 44% are women and 56% are men. But then when you look at those who are working as researchers, it is 14%. So if there's such a big drop, that means that some percentage of women are leaving, a large percentage of women are leaving. It is nothing about the population as a whole.
One more question I have is, when we say assertive measures to correct this, considering that where we are as a society and a little longer at this point, what are the realistic goals that we can put forward? I'm assuming that the ultimate goal would be where you say that everywhere is almost 53% or irrespective of gender. Say what, like how do we work towards it? What are the most tangible goals, say, for the next 5 years?
Okay, so for example, the DST has identified that one big problem in India is that women are taking breaks in their career to have children or get married or whatever and not coming back. So they have a policy right now that they should come back. So it funds them to come back. But it funds them for 3 years or 5 years. And that is successful. Okay, maybe the numbers are not so small, it's a few hundred a year, but it's still substantial. But so that's a very good step, I think. But the next step is what happens to those women after 3 years or 5 years? Because they then have to get permanent jobs. And by that time, they are 40 or 45. And then institutes have to be willing to hire them, and they have to be willing to hire them over men who are coming with fresh postdocs and who are 35. And so you have to change that mindset then. And that I don't see happening. So we have to tackle that now.
So just sort of following up on that in a way, and this so a few things that probably the DST or other central could immediately do are this two-body problem, make it almost illegal for institutions to have a written or what I mean, definitely a written rule, but even an unwritten rule.
Yeah, but it's very hard to fight an unwritten rule because people will not say we are not hiring her because of the unwritten rule. They'll just say, oh, she's not good enough. So what do you do?
But in the committees, at least if there's a sort of a sensitization of that, that this cannot be used, because I've heard it being said in places, and people don't shy away from saying it. So at least if it could be pushed, people would.
Yeah, I don't know how to push it through. I mean, like I was on this task force for women in science and the standing committee for women in science, and both times we put it in our recommendation, and that's all. I mean, we put it in the recommendation and it died a quiet death. So
Maybe a second, maybe easier thing, and again, I know DST sometimes has sent out circulars is about this daycare centers, making it mandatory, but is that something that there is much progress on, or even?
yeah, I think they're not enforcing that, so they should enforce that. Yeah.
And especially for this break that you mentioned, if there are crashes starting from 6 months old or 3 months,
then there may not be so many breaks. Yeah.
it may be easier, and it should be advertised, and usually people often do it as some kind of side thing, and it's neglected, and maybe parents may not even feel comfortable in putting their children there because of the environment there. But so these things perhaps I think could be implemented in a short term.
I think it's people in positions like yours who have to push for that. No, I mean, I'm not saying it sarcastically, I'm saying it seriously. I mean, you have the clout to push for it.
Whatever one can.
Yeah. And maybe, and I also think it's very important that men push for these things, because sometimes people say, oh, you women should fight for these things. But I think it's it's a societal problem, and men and women have to fight together for these things. Yeah.
Second last question from Joel, then last.
What's your opinion on reservations for women? Like how arguments which go on about that?
You want me to know what I think?
Yeah.
I'm actually confused about it because I do think that I don't think it's a level playing field, and I think if you have reservations, it will just level it a little bit. I think there's still a lot of discrimination in hiring, and some of that will be corrected if you have reservations. But at the same time, I think there will be immense resentment against those women who are hired through reservations, and they will not be treated well. And whether it is still worth having them in those positions anyway, I honestly do not know. I'm still confused about that.
About this, one thing that Rama told was to consider the financial background as well. Just not creating a gender-based reservation, but also to study their financial background.
Yeah, but then there's so many things you have to consider, right? How it's such a multi-dimensional space. I don't know how to set the parameters.
Have something like a charter or a declaration that individuals, institutions at various levels can adopt. Just as a statement, I've seen similar things in other have on websites of individuals or institutions which declare that we as a community or I as an individual scientist.
I think it would be a very good idea, and also in the area of sexual harassment, I think everybody should sign some policy that they're aware of the rules against sexual harassment and that they subscribe to these policies. So yeah, I think it would be very good.